What's up, guys? Welcome to another Tech Pod event. I'm starting things off here today. You might have seen Joseph start things off, but what's up, Luke? What's up, RF? Nice to see you guys. See, there's quite a few of you guys here already. Whoop, whoop, yes. Are you guys excited for Kenton today? What's up, Berkeley? Nice seeing you. Parth. Cool. Yeah, we're just gonna wait a couple minutes, let people kind of roll in. Hello. Where's everybody tuning in from today? I'm currently in Union City, which is like a small city in the Bay. Not many people know about it, so I usually just say like Fremont or something. But generally in like the East Bay, SF Bay area. Atlanta, Georgia, nice. Hello. Miami, Chicago, Dublin, Dallas. Oh, wow. Someone from Morocco. NYC, Philly, Chicago, Boston. Wow, okay. So we've got all over the States, and then some people are even outside, like Canada, Vancouver. Nice. Very cool. But yeah, are you guys all interested in PM here? Are you guys pumped for this workshop? India, nice. Let's see. Yeah, just gonna wait 2 more minutes here, and then we're gonna go ahead and get started. But I guess just as a quick plug, I'm going to talk a little bit about what TechPod is. So TechPod is a community of students interested in the business side of tech. We have a bunch of cool initiatives like the newsletter. We have a mentorship program as well as a fellowship program. And within the mentorship program, we connect you to a mentor in the business side of tech. And then as for the fellowship program, if you're interested in creating LinkedIn content, we help you become a LinkedIn content influencer. But yeah, that's a little bit about us. And then I'm just going to drop the link to our newsletter in the chat here. Feel free to give it a subscribe if you're interested. We send out weekly editions. And inside each of these weekly editions, we have fresh job posts. So if you're interested in internships or full-time jobs in the business side of tech, make sure to subscribe. It's an easy way to just be in the know about what's happening. Cool. It seems like people are excited to learn more about PM. Some folks come from a CS background. Let's see. Brandon is pumped in capital. We love that. But yeah, let's see. Keep a couple more seconds to roll on in. Let's see. Cool. All right, I think we can just about get started here. So I'm gonna bring Kenton up on stage. Welcome, Kenton. Do you want to just introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. My name is Kenton Kavestu. I am the founder of RocketBlocks, which is an online platform that helps candidates prepare for interviews. We help across a bunch of different types of interviews for consulting, and then a bunch of different tech ones, product management, product marketing, and strategy and biz ops roles. And then, of course, today we'll be talking about the product management side. And I'll go into a little bit of my intro more when I jump into the slides and some of my background, and why I'm particularly excited to chat with you all about this topic.
Awesome. Great. So Kenton's going to take the stage now, And yeah, take it away. And here you should be able to see his slides. Can everybody see Kenton's slides? Say yes in the chat if you can. I think there might be like a couple seconds delay between chat versus real time, but I think everybody should be able to see that.
We good to go?
Yes, let's see. Okay. Hopefully we are. I think we are though. Yes, okay, there's the yeses. All right, yes, we're good to go.
Awesome. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. Of course, we're talking about breaking into product management and specifically passing the technical bar without a technical background. I'm very excited to talk about this topic. I want to give a little bit of a breakdown of how we're going to go about this today. So the goal and the agenda is to really understand the technical questions, the type of topics that interviewers and PM interviews are going to test you on to see if you're technical enough. Because especially if you're coming from a non-technical background, this is that challenge that you're going to have coming into these questions and figuring out how can you put your best foot forward if you don't have a formal technical background like a CS degree, or maybe you taught yourself how to code, something like that. So first part, we're going to talk about what to expect, sample questions. We're going to talk a little bit about what are the questions behind the question. And then we're going to categorize the sort of technical questions that you can face. And then in the second part of this, we're going to actually look at some of these questions and talk through potential answers to them, and give a little bit of a sense of like what a good answer to one of these particular questions looks like. Okay, so first let's start off with a little bit of why am I talking to you about product management, breaking in without a technical background. It is the background that I have. So I've basically been a career PM before starting my own company at RocketBlocks. However, I don't have any formal technical training. My undergrad degree or degrees is in economics and history from the University of Virginia. So I faced the same sort of challenge of sort of trying to prove to people that I was technical enough the first time I was trying to get a PM job. My background in products and where I've built has basically been at a huge range of companies, from very large companies like Google, all the way down to now smaller companies like my own company, RocketBlocks, which is a handful of employees. And I've worked at sort of every stage in between. So Zynga, when I was there, was between about 1,000 to 3,000 person company. And Flurry was about 100 person company when I was there before it ultimately got acquired by Yahoo. And I've launched and sort of built products and run interviews and been through the interview process at a bunch of different stages of companies and seen what this looks like as well. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk a little bit about what to expect. And even before I jump into sort of what to expect in the technical component of interviews, when you're going down the product management path, I do want to pause here for a second and talk about PM interviews in general and zoom out and say that as you're going through product management interviews, you can expect to be tested on a handful of different skill sets. One is typically product design and product sense, like how does this person think about products, what type of features to build, how they would sequence it, how they would measure if it's working, et cetera. So that's one key bucket. Another bucket is analytical, data-driven thinking. How does this person use data, analytics, metrics to solve questions, to think about what to build, et cetera. This is also often called product execution if you're going through the Facebook process. For whatever reason, they refer to those type of questions as the execution term. And then a third big bucket is technical. Of course, for folks that are trying to break into product management without a formal technical background, this is the category that they're often sweating the most, because product design is something that anyone can come at from a bunch of different angles. Analytics and data is also something that anyone can come to from a bunch of different angles. Like if you're an econ major, you might be great at analytics and working with data as well. You pick that up other places. Technical is the one category where if you haven't been formally trained, say in CS or have a degree, it's really sort of nerve-wracking going into these interviews because you're like, well, I don't have that sort of background. How could I ever do this? And so that's what we're going to focus on and talk about today. So let's jump into some examples right away. What I want to do is just sort of talk about what you can actually expect if you go into product management interviews at companies, big tech companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and the sort of up and coming class of tech companies as well. So companies like Airbnb, Uber, DoorDash, places like that. And the first category of technical question I want to talk about is a technical explainer question. So this might be something like, explain what an API is to your grandfather. It's a question that is really about taking a technical concept and just sort of explaining it to someone who may not know what it is. It's trying to see if you can explain a particular concept more than anything else. It's not asking you to actually write any code or do anything like that. You're just trying to explain sort of a technical concept to someone else and see if you can talk through that concept in a particularly coherent and effective way. Okay. A second technical example, this one's a little more in depth, but we're going to stay on the topic of APIs. And actually, before I jump into this, for folks on the call that are not technical and haven't heard of an API before or don't know what an API is, API stands for Application Programming Interface. So that's the acronym that you're working with. That's what that means. It is basically a way for two computers or two pieces of software to communicate effectively with each other by communicating with certain sort of agreed upon language and an agreed upon structure of how they pass information back and forth. So let's look at a second technical question that again might be focused on APIs, but might go a little deeper. So imagine in this case, you're interviewing at LinkedIn, for example, and they ask you, or your interviewer asks you this question. I'm going to go ahead and just read it so we can all get on the same page here. So imagine that you've logged into your LinkedIn account and you've landed on the homepage with your LinkedIn newsfeed prominently displayed in the center of the page. Walk us through the API response that the LinkedIn front end must have looked like, or must have received to make the screen you see possible. Please highlight roughly what the structure of the API response could have been and what the key pieces of data sent from the backend are. So in this case, this is like a deeper question that requires you to think specifically about the LinkedIn UI here, the LinkedIn experience, and thinking about, okay, what would the API have sent to be able to create this? Now, this is a type of question where, yes, it's going a little bit more technical, but if you come at this from a non-technical perspective, once you have an understanding of like what the idea of an API is, you could actually look at the screen and from a common sense perspective, actually sort of walk your way through this. Because ultimately this question is really asking you what information was sent from LinkedIn servers all the way to your browser or your mobile phone, wherever you're looking at this LinkedIn page, to create what you're seeing. And so you, as just any user or customer looking at the screen, could say, well, there's a few different things I see here. One, like I see, there's like a post from my friend Cassie. So it must have said, the backend must have sent in some information about a post. There's some metadata attached to it, which, has her name. It's got her job title below that. It's got the amount of likes and comments that are already on the post. And then of course it's got a link to the particular piece of information she was sharing here, which looks like a job listing for a director of marketing she may have been hiring for. So you can actually start thinking and talking about that with fairly common sense language and working through this problem. But this is another example of what an API type question might look like. A third example, we're going to switch from APIs here and talk about just the general concept of tech stacks. So when you're working in any particular product, for those that are not familiar with the term tech stack, this is a term that product managers, engineers will use to refer to the various technologies that are used to make a product come to life and the various different components. So for example, in most technical products at a very simple level, there's the backend, the code that's running on the backend to produce and run whatever sort of service or product it happens to be. In this case, we're talking about Gmail. And the front end, like the way that the code that helps format and present the product to the user, how it looks, the type of interactions that will happen on screen, et cetera. And you can go deeper into sort of front end, back end, and talk about the different technologies that are used at those different layers. For some context, why this is often important and comes up in the context of a product management job is that as you are building new features, when you propose like, hey, I think we should do this in the product, one of the first questions that will often be is like, well, where in the tech stack, what do we actually need to change about the product to make that a reality? And that's a common type of question that will come up in interviews. So if you look at this particular question, let's go ahead and just quickly read this. Gmail is considering adding a new delayed send functionality, which would allow a user to schedule an email he or she wrote to be delivered at some point in the future. If the feature is approved by a group product manager for this quarter, you'll be the PM responsible for implementing it and launching it. Which key parts of the Gmail tech stack would require work to launch something like this? Assume that no work to support a feature like this has been done before. So what are they really asking in a question like this? They are proposing that you are going to be thinking about launching a new feature, and they're asking, hey, if you want to launch this particular type of feature, what are we going to need to change and build in the product to make it a reality? So it's a very common type of question that might come up to test a product manager candidate's technical skills in an interview. Oops. Okay, I forgot there was a little animation there. Okay, so what's the interviewer looking for when they're asking these sort of technical questions of a PM candidate? One of the key things that I want to call out is that the technical questions are not designed to test and understand if a product manager is a good coder, if he or she can actually write really efficient code. Occasionally, like once in a blue moon, you will get like either a super technical company or a super technical person at a company like Google that really wants to try and like test someone's coding ability, but that is not the norm in product management interviews these days. And increasingly, that becomes rarer and rarer that someone is looking for that. What folks are really looking for from product manager candidates when they're talking about these technical issues are three things. The first is they want to see that a product manager candidate, regardless of their technical background, is comfortable and effective communicating around technical topics. And the reason that's important is because as a product manager day-to-day on the job, you are going to be working with a team of engineers to build, release, and optimize a particular product that is built with code. And so there's going to be all sorts of issues that come up and tasks on the job that require you to interact with your engineering team to make it happen. And so you need to be able, even if you are not a technical wizard, and you're not going to make all the decisions about how the database is structured or what type of database technology you're going to use, you need to be able to talk about those issues and understand what your engineers are telling you if you need to have a conversation about, hey, we need to update the database and that's going to take us, a week to do, and et cetera, and here's why, for example. The second key thing that they're looking for is they want to understand that the candidate understands the product implications of technical decisions. So, for example, if an engineer comes to you and says, hey, we're planning on changing this in the back end, or we're thinking that we want to move from this particular front end language to this other front end language. Are you okay with that? As a product manager, they want to know that you can say, oh, if you're moving from this language to this language, is that going to prevent us from doing any of the things we want from like a feature perspective or delivering the value we need to deliver to the user? And if that's the case, they want a product manager to be able to think, okay, we're talking about this sort of technical decision. What product implications does that have? And so that's really important. And if you think about that Gmail question we were just talking about, that's a key part of it. You're thinking about what are the actual implications of a certain product decision or a certain technical decision. The third thing that these two things really sort of bubble together and roll up to is this third category of earning trust. As a product manager, you are going to be a partner to your engineering team. You're going to work with that team to build and to release features, and you need to be able to earn the trust of the technical leads and the engineering team that you work with. And the way that you earn that trust with those engineers and those team members is by basically being able to work with them effectively, communicate effectively, understand the implications of their work and to do that over time, and also not to be overbearing. Like on the flip side, if you actually come from a really technical background, one of the challenges is trying to dictate to the engineering team how everything should work, because you have a technical background and you want to sort of weigh in. On the flip side, if that's your case, you want to sort of be able to balance the technical skills you bring to the table with also understanding the perspective your engineers are bringing, and the fact that they're in the product day to day. Maybe they have some interesting, valid perspectives that you need to consider as well. But so the bottom line, and the thing to take away from this slide, is that when interviewers are asking technical questions in PM interviews, the goal is not to see if you know how to write a bubble sort algorithm, or if you know this particular function or way to do this in Python. Really what they're trying to understand is actually, can this person sort of operate in a technical environment with an engineering team? Do they understand how to communicate effectively? Do they understand the product implications of certain technical decisions? And if not, can they ask the right questions to get the information they need? And put those together, can they earn the trust of that team so that this team can operate effectively, right? If you have a product manager that has not earned the trust of the engineering team over time, it will be really hard for those two groups to come together and actually build and launch and manage a successful product. Okay, so let's talk about a few categories of technical questions that come up. We've already talked a little bit. We looked at some API questions, we looked at some tech stack questions, but I want to just categorize a bunch of the common categories that come up. The first is general technical questions. So these are things like the example here I have is, how does the internet work? A variation of this is how does a mobile app work? If you open the Uber app, how does that screen you see get created? What happens there? But how does the internet work is sort of a canonical question. It gets asked a ton. I think most people that have gone through probably 3 or 4 PM interviews at different companies have faced this question probably at one point. And basically what someone's looking to understand is, if they say, okay, if you go to open Chrome or open Safari and you type in google.com or you type in yelp.com, how does that experience that you see as a consumer get created? And the reason they'll ask a question like that, again, is they want to see if you understand sort of the building blocks of how a technical product gets delivered to an end customer. Again, they're not really concerned that the ins and outs of, say, DNS servers, domain name servers, and that you could actually program one of them yourselves, which is maybe something an engineer might be responsible for doing, or that you could write the backend code that would deliver an API response, but they want to understand that those different components and how they fit together. Okay. Second common category is APIs. One of the reasons that APIs, I think, end up being an incredibly common category is because they are just a core part of the infrastructure that helps create any sort of modern software product. So you have, your front end code, which lives, either on the client or is delivered by the back end, and you have your back end code, databases, processes running on the back end that are storing data. And then you have APIs often communicating between those two layers and sending information back and forth. Because of that, because it's so sort of critical to making a lot of modern web products work, people often like to ask, well, tell me what sort of API do you think would be used in Uber Eats? What's the type of information that would be passed back and forth? This is the same type of question we were talking about with LinkedIn earlier, where it's hey, what do you think the API response to create the LinkedIn homepage for any particular user looks like? It's just trying to get a sense of if you can talk about some of those basic building blocks. Okay, third category is databases. Typical questions here might be asking about, hey, if we want to create this type of experience where we're showing, these posts with this information in LinkedIn, what type of information are we gonna have to store on the back end? It's, again, not trying to get a sense from you about whether you're an expert on some back end products like MongoDB, or you can talk about the detailed differences between Postgres and MySQL. Instead, what they're trying to get a sense again is like, can this person talk about database topics that are sort of relevant to product decisions? Like, hey, if we want to create this product experience, what information do we need to store about our users? That's a question that's sort of oriented around databases and is technical, but is not, again, like deeply technical or asking you about the nitty gritty of like how that, say, database technology works. A fourth category, and this is relevant to the Gmail conversation we talked about, is tech stack. So do you understand how various components of a technical product fit together to create that experience? Things like the front end, APIs, back end, databases all come together to make a modern tech product work. And then the last category here that increasingly you're seeing a little bit of conversation about in product management interviews, especially if the role has some sort of AI or machine learning bent, is some questions about machine learning and how to think about deploying the type of models that you might build in machine learning. So the example here is, what's the difference between precision and recall, which are two metrics that are often used to evaluate the performance of various machine learning models. Okay, so I think, if you're going through interviews as a candidate, you come from a non-technical background, these are the types and categories of questions that you might expect to face, and that even if you are not a CS major, you would want to get familiar enough with these topics that you would be able to sort of discuss and talk about them, because of the type of things that could come up in an interview. It doesn't mean they're necessarily going to. And every company that hires product managers has a different sort of threshold for where their technical bar is. A company like Google is certainly going to ask some of these questions. They'll have one particular interview that's dedicated to assessing a candidate's technical ability and whether they're technical enough. A company like Airbnb may not end up pressing on technical stuff that much, or even at all, because they're more design focused, more front end focused, less concerned about that particular skill set. We'll probably press on it a little bit, but it'll probably trend much more toward the easier sort of questions in this category. Okay, what I want to touch on a little bit is there are sort of deeper technical questions that historically, in some cases, have come up in product management interviews. They are increasingly rare. And my perspective on this is that if you are coming to product management from a non-technical background, it does not make sense to try and memorize technical, like some of this type of technical stuff so that you can answer these type of questions, simply because it's really hard to build enough of that knowledge, at least in the span of, like, say, preparing for a particular interview. So it's the type of thing where if this type of question comes up, I think it's better to just talk about how, like, you don't have a technical background. This is not your area of expertise. And, think about how you would work with your engineers to solve this particular type of question or to build something, rather than trying to, memorize answers to these, because that often doesn't work particularly well. But to give you a sense of what some of these questions look like, these often will come up in, questions probably of this ilk, but maybe a little tougher in, like, engineering interviews, is like, design an algorithm to take a string, like a string of words or text, and reverse it. In terms of data structures, they may just ask you what a various types of data structures are, and if you can explain it. And then a third category here that's common is like system design, like design, an elevator system for a building as an example, or maybe like, talk about how you would change a software system in a tech stack to scale from, say, supporting 1 million users to 10 million users. That's, again, like a very technical process that is going to require real sort of engineering experience to be able to do. Again, which is why I would recommend, not the type of thing you want to try and memorize an answer to, and not the type of thing, if you're coming from a non-technical background, you probably don't want to spend your time trying to focus on this. You want to probably think about some of those lighter technical questions I was talking about that I think you can credibly answer if you come from a non-technical background, by doing some studying, by thinking about those questions, figuring out good sort of answers for those, and teaching yourself. and not focusing on the stuff that really would require like deeper sort of CS knowledge. Okay. So let's go ahead and do some brainstorming together. And I want to see if we can use the chat box for this. So let's see. Can folks still see my screen? I think so, right? Okay, where is the chat? Okay. So let's talk about this question, explain an API to your grandfather. Is there anyone on the chat right now that would want to take a stab at typing some of the analogies you might use if you were trying to explain an API to someone who is non-technical, like your grandfather or your grandmother, or just like your friend who's an English major? Or explain it to prior Kenton, who was like a history major at UVA, you know, first year. I had no technical experience, never heard of an API before. And I'm looking at the comments now. Does anyone want to take a stab at this? Like, what's a version of an analogy you could potentially use? No takers here. Okay, so I'm gonna wait and see if anyone wants to chime in. But in the meantime, I'm gonna throw out an example that I might use. So if I were trying to explain an API to my grandfather, I would probably use an analogy of a menu at a restaurant. And so let's imagine that you're walking into McDonald's and you want to order a Big Mac from McDonald's. The menu in this case that lets you walk up to the cashier and say, hey, I'd like a Big Mac. And then magically, a few minutes later, someone comes and gives you a burger that has 2 patties, a bun on the top, bun on the bottom, the middle bun row, the McDonald's special sauce, a little bit of like the lettuce and onions and whatever else comes on a Big Mac. The fact that you were just able to say, I want a Big Mac, and then that specific combination of burger, buns, onions, lettuce, special sauce comes back to you, that menu is sort of acting as an API in that case. And so if you think about it, what's happening is that the menu is basically saying, look, here's a standardized way to communicate with me. And so if you tell me you want a Big Mac, we're going to return a bunch of ingredients to you in a very specific direction. Now, if you didn't have that API and you walk into a restaurant like McDonald's and you're trying to tell the cashier that like you want, you know, a burger that has 2 specific patties with a bun on top, a bun on the bottom, another little middle bun in between those 2 patties, and then you want a special sauce made of like some ketchup and some mayo, and you want some onions on it and some lettuce, like that would be crazy. You would walk into McDonald's and spend, you know, 15 minutes trying to explain what you want. And that's the same thing that basically an API is solving for in software. An API is basically a way for one computer system to say, look, I've got a bunch of information here. Maybe it's a database with a bunch of information about users. Like say it's LinkedIn. Let's go back to the LinkedIn example. It's a database that holds all the information about the connections that Kenton has on LinkedIn. Instead of like the front end having to go and say like, hey, go find all the information about Kenton's friends and things like that, there's a way that the LinkedIn API basically will allow the front end to say like, hey, give me Kenton's friends and give me, you know, like X information about them. And the back end will just return like, hey, here's a list of Kenton's friends, his network connections, here's like their job titles, you know, bunch of information, like maybe the last time they posted, all that type of stuff. So this is that same concept. This is how it works. There's a bunch of different ways you can use analogies to explain a technical concept like an API. The menu is a personal favorite of mine, but I've talked to other folks. I recently heard a good example from one of the Product Buds founders who talked about, the example of a wedding planner and how a wedding planner can act like an API where you can tell a wedding planner like, hey, I want this particular food to be at my wedding. And then they go and do all the work and coordination. Like they go find the chefs and they make sure that they cook the right dish and that it shows up at the right time and it's the right quantity. It handles all this work in the background for you, but gives you a standard way to communicate it with saying like, hey, I want this particular dish at my wedding. So I'm looking at the chat window here. And let's see, let's see the other examples are called out. Like a dictionary translator between different programs. Okay. We've got another example. Imagine you have a product, but to get your end product, you need to use the input from another software. So that's a good example from Mohammed. There's many cases where modern software products are using lots of external APIs. So that means they're using APIs from other companies to pull together information from other sources to make their experience work. So that's a good one. Let's see, there's Victor is talking about an analogy would be my granddad requesting me to get him info on shoes, and then I give him that info. I like that. I'm not quite sure. Maybe there's some fun conversations about shoes in that case, but maybe it's like, hey, like, tell me what the latest Nikes are. And Victor knows what the latest Nikes are. And so he comes and says, okay, here's the 10 latest Nikes. Here's like the color combinations they come in and what's cool and special about them, that type of thing. That would be like a shoe information API. I like J-Rod here said it's like a menu. I'm not sure if he said that before or after me. Jihao, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Hopefully I did. API is like a waiter server between the customer and kitchen. That's a great one. That's very similar to the menu thing. But it's the exact same type of interaction, right? It's that layer that's communicating back and forth between two entities. So I really like that. Shirley talked about menu as well. And it looks like maybe Stella is reacting to the fact that that's the same analogy I used. Cool. Okay, so this is good. Let's try revisiting one of the other questions we talked about in the beginning, which is the tech stacks question around Gmail. So again, let me just sort of read and set the stage here. So Gmail is basically considering adding new delayed send functionality. This would allow a user to schedule an email that he or she wrote to be sent some point in the future. Now let's imagine Gmail doesn't have this feature at all, because today it actually exists. But if Gmail did not have this functionality, if you were the PM in charge of launching this, what parts of the actual Gmail product of the tech stack would you have to change? So why don't we do this? In the chat, why don't folks just start calling out parts of the Gmail product that would have to change to support functionality like a scheduled send? And I'm going to get us started as folks are thinking about this. But one of the ways I like to think through these type of questions is if I say, okay, like I'm going to build a new feature, what am I going to have to like change? Like what in the tech stack is going to have to change to make it work? I like to think about it just from the user perspective and say, okay, where do I start as a user? So if I want to have this feature, the very first thing I think of from a user perspective is, well, I need somewhere in the app, in the Gmail app, where I can say like, hey, I want this email to be sent, but not right now. I want it to be sent in the future. So like I need at the very minimum some button or some link. Like I need a UI change that's going to go into the front end that's going to let a user like Kenton say, hey, don't send this now, send it in the future. But then if you take that a step further, right, I don't just want to send it anytime in the future. Like I have a specific need probably that I want. Like I want this email to be sent in 8 hours, or I want it specifically to be sent in 20 hours, for example, or 24 hours, whatever the case is. So I need some input mechanism. I need some way to tell Gmail, hey, like I want this feature, or sorry, I want this email to be sent, Friday at 10 a.m. So I need a button or a link that lets me sort of like open some sort of widget that lets me schedule it, right? Great. And now we've got some comments. So Tyler mentioned, okay, so let's say I take the first part of that. I'm like, okay, we need, to make some changes to the UI. We need a button and we need some sort of scheduling widget. Then say I schedule this email to be sent tomorrow. As Tyler said, that email's got to be stored somewhere, right? Like we need to store the email even though it hasn't been sent. So we need to store it, and we probably need some sort of like flag that we store as well. Some sort of information that lives in our database that says, hey, this email is like a pending email. It's not an email that we've already sent. So we're going to need to store it, and we're going to need to store it separately so that the system knows that we know on the back end, hey, this is an email that hasn't been sent yet versus this is another email that was sent. And then, okay, I'm looking at some of the other comments here. Adjusting the send buttons, we talked about that. Calendar and clock, we sort of talked about that. Delayed delivery, similar to Outlook Mail. So I agree, we definitely need delayed delivery. I think that from Shazia, I would encourage you, go a little more specific there. Like, how do we make this delayed delivery happen? J-Rod has an interesting comment here about maintaining editing capabilities in case we want to change the message. That's a really nice sort of, I wouldn't call it an edge case, but it's a use case to consider. Like, hey, Kenton scheduled this email to be sent Friday at noon, but then, at Friday at 10 a.m., he decided, hey, he wants to change some of the text in there. So can he do that? And if so, it's worth thinking about where does he go to actually do that? So Stella just suggested, there's like an iteration on the drafts folder. Maybe there's a scheduled folder, things that have scheduled but haven't been sent yet. So that's another thing you think about, okay, like how are we going to store that information on the back end, and how is it going to be represented in the UI? Then another thing to think about, there's one major thing that if you were building this feature hasn't been mentioned that you would have to build if scheduled delivery has not been launched yet. So Federico suggested like an option to cancel the send. That's a good suggestion. I do think like you'd probably want like a delete button, like a Control-Z, like, oh no, I don't want to send that email, like just delete it. I agree. That's not the particular thing I'm thinking of, but if there's anyone else that on the back end, like if you think about, here's a clue. If you think about how Gmail works before you have this functionality, anytime an email is written, you click the send button, and then Gmail on the back end just fires that email off to like wherever it's supposed to go, right? They just send it that instant. They don't think about it. You click send, they send it. If in the future you're saying, hey, I want you to send this tomorrow, or I want you to send this Saturday, and extrapolate out, millions of users are telling Gmail, hey, send this Saturday, send it next Tuesday, whatever the date is. How does Gmail go from a world where they send everything immediately to a world where they somehow know that there's a bunch of emails that are supposed to be sent on Tuesday or Wednesday in the future, and they should store them until that date? Okay. So Teddy said it. He said, need a metadata trigger so when the correct date time comes around, the backend knows when to send the email. This is exactly right. What I also love about what Teddy said here is like, those are probably not that's not like the technical term of what I would call what's happening on the back end. Like typically you'd probably hear an engineer say, well, we got to write like a job or create like a process that's going to run on the back end, and every second it's going to loop over the database and find emails that are marked pending and see if it's time to send them, and then it's going to send them if so. But what's great about what Teddy said, and this is a point that I wanted to make specifically about this question, so I'm really glad he called it out this way, is if you are a non-technical person approaching product management, it is helpful and even, I would say, advantageous to think about what needs to be done in common sense terms. And if you can articulate that, that is often what a lot of companies want to see. They want to know that you can think about the components, even if you don't know the technical verbiage. So the fact that Teddy said, hey, there's something that needs to exist that will take an email that is scheduled and send it when it needs to, that's the type of insight you need if you're working with engineers as a PM. You don't need to know that that might be called a process or a job on the back end, or you don't need to know how to actually write the Java that might do that. That's not the job of the PM. But the job of the PM is to understand all the different components and why they're needed. So the type of stuff that all of you have been calling out, like, hey, you might need an option to cancel the send. You're going to need like a clock and a calendar to schedule it. All those type of things. So this is great. You guys covered basically all the key topics. And the last part I'll really emphasize is what I was talking about, though. It's more important to understand the components and from a common sense perspective, what needs to happen to create the experience you want than it is to know all the nitty-gritty technical terms that are about it. Because if you understand the components of what needs to happen, that's the key part of being a product manager. That's the key part that companies are concerned about when they're talking to a candidate that maybe doesn't have a CS background, is that like, oh, this person's never going to understand how these pieces all fit together. But if you can demonstrate you know how the pieces fit together, even if you don't know all the language, oftentimes companies are really excited about that because the hard part is understanding the pieces. So great work to everyone that participated, and thank you to everyone who chimed in the chat comments. This is super helpful. I usually do this presentation over Zoom where people just sort of like raise their hand and chime in over audio. And so this section would have been really quiet if not for the participation of everyone here, like Brandon, Tyler, Federico, Jabemi, Stella, etc. So thank you to everyone that participated. That's great. Okay, I'm just going to go back into bigger screen. And okay, so I'm going to lay out sort of the 6 buckets that I would talk about if someone gave me that particular Gmail question in an interview and I was going through it. And what you're going to see is that through that chat participation we just did, you called out a lot of these. The first thing I would start by doing is state some assumptions that I'm making. So I would say, one of my assumptions is that the user is going to need some new button or option to create a delayed send. And second, that the system will need a new process to check for delayed emails and deliver them, but we can utilize existing code for the actual sending of an email. Like once we decide we need to send it, like we can reuse the Gmail code that exists for that. So those are my assumptions. And then, as I mentioned, I start with the design and just started working my way through it. So the first thing is on the design front, like the UX team is going to need to create some assets for us to create a new button or maybe a link if we decide to do that, as well as some sort of scheduling widget. So this is like the calendar and clock that a few different people called out, as well as the button that's going to sort of pop that up on screen. Okay. So then there's going to be like some front end features. Like we need to get that design work into the front end. We need to figure out where is that button going to go or link if we decide. And then we actually, need to do the work to update it. And the front end is, there's going to be a little bit of work to do, the front end when it's accessed through the web. So what does this look like in a Chrome browser for my desktop or my laptop computer? And also, what about on a mobile device? Like the experience of using Gmail on a mobile device is different. It's a much smaller screen. So where does that button go? How does it look? Do we do something slightly different on mobile? Does it need to be different on iOS for Android? Probably not, but it's something we might want to think through. And then on the back end, we're going to need that job or processor, some sort of queue that we were talking about to check on a continuous cadence for emails that were scheduled and see, hey, is this the time it was supposed to be scheduled? If so, let's send it out. We need something. That's like the critical component on the back end that we need to make this happen. And then on the database, the other sort of critical thing is we need some sort of basically holding pen. Either we create a new table on the database, or maybe for the existing emails, we create some new columns that keep track of whether this particular email has been sent, and already sent off, or it's in pending state, something like that. It doesn't have to be called pending, whatever we want, pending state, and what is the time that it actually should be sent at. So those are the 6 buckets that I would call out. Okay, so we got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to talk a little bit about some tips for how to prepare for this component of the interviews. 3 things that I think about. First is online research. So if you're going into one of these interviews with a particular company, do some research on Glassdoor, Blind, etc. Get a sense of what type of technical questions these companies have asked in the past. This is really helpful because you want to know, like, is this the type of company that tends not to ask PMs many technical questions, in which case, great, like you may not have to deal with much of this. Or is this a company that's definitely going to ask me some technical stuff? And if so, what's the nature of the technical stuff do they ask? Do they like to ask like general technical questions, like how does the internet work? Or do they like to ask a lot about like APIs or tech stacks? Or, you know, if it's maybe a more technical company or a role that's going to involve some ML, like should I expect them to ask about ML related topics, things like that. So first part is always start out by doing your research. There's online resources, like I mentioned, Glassdoor, Blind, etc. But if you have friends that have gone to work at those companies, I'd reach out and ask them. They can be a great source of information as well. That sort of bleeds into my second topic here, which is like talk to your allies. So allies you have are friends, which I already mentioned, recruiters that you're working with. Recruiters can be a huge ally to you through the process. Once you are going through the interview process, recruiters are aligned with you in that they want you to get the job as well. Like their job is to bring people in, get them through the process and get them hired. And once a recruiter has like started talking to you and has you in their funnel, they want you to get the job. So be nice to your recruiters. Oftentimes, not oftentimes, but sometimes people are rude to recruiters. They don't really treat them very well. That's a huge mistake. Recruiters don't usually make the decision. In most cases, they will not make the decision about whether you get hired or not, unless the recruiter happens to be the hiring manager, which typically only happens at small companies. But they can be really helpful in your process, because if they like you, if you've been fair to them, they may give you a lot of information about like, hey, here's what to expect in these interviews. Here's the type of questions that they're going to ask. Here's, they may tell you stuff that they aren't telling other candidates, which can be a huge advantage for you. For example, they may say, hey, like someone went through this interview last week, and here's the type of questions that the PM asked on technical stuff. And maybe they weren't supposed to share that with you, but maybe they share it with you. That gives you an advantage. Cold reach outs on LinkedIn if you don't know anyone at the particular company that you can ask, like, what are these interviews like, et cetera. Sometimes reaching out on LinkedIn cold, especially if you formulate that message well, reach out, say like, hey, I'm coming into an interview at company X. I saw you work here. I'm really worried about technical questions of X nature. Do you have any advice? Do you have any sense for what type of stuff I should practice for, et cetera? You may not get a ton of responses, but all it might take is like 1 or 2 good responses that could be really helpful. The third thing to do is practice. So answering these technical questions, going through this type of stuff, it gets a lot easier the more you do it. And hopefully, as you saw going through that Gmail example, something that seems like a fairly technical question, like talking about all the different components of the tech stack, if you get in the practice of thinking about it, even from a non-technical perspective, you can start teaching yourself common sense how these products fit together and how to talk about them in an interview. And that gets better the more you drill yourself. So practice makes perfect and helps a lot. Lastly, RocketBlocks, the product that I work on, the company that I run, helps specifically with doing this practice. This is sort of our reason for being. It was built because I struggled with this problem when I was first going through the process of like, hey, I know what's going to be asked of me, but how do I actually build these skills and get better at it? So there is a ton of drills that are designed to help you build and perfect the core skills that are going to get tested in product management interviews. Obviously, we've been focusing on technical skills today, But RocketBlocks covers the whole gamut from technical to product design, analytics and metrics, estimation questions, product strategy, etc. So thank you to everyone who attended, and thank you for all the great participation in the chat window. I really appreciate that. Makes it a lot more fun and interactive to do these workshops. And then lastly, we have a coupon code for everyone that's been on this call through TechPod. If you're interested in using the RocketBlocks product, you can go to rocketblocks.me. That's our homepage. And if you click the sign up today button, we have a TechPod 20 coupon that will give you 20% off your monthly account. Any combination of the different prep modules that we have: product management, consulting, product marketing, strategy, biz op, you name it, any combination of those as well. So thank you so much to everyone for joining today. And I hope that you all have a good experience in the recruiting process. And if you're trying to break into product management from a non-technical perspective, that this helps demystify a little bit of what to expect in the technical component of interviews and how to prepare and how to think about that.
Cool. Yeah, that was an awesome presentation, Kenton. Thank you so much for the very thorough breakdown of what to expect. And I think this was especially helpful because I'm personally non-technical, and it was really insightful to hear how you would personally answer these questions, and also get to hear some of the audience members as well.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Great participation. I loved it.
Yeah. But yeah, this is pretty much it for this event. If you guys, everybody's saying thank you, yes. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Kenton. And once again, the code is TechPod20 if you guys would like 20% off your monthly account. I believe I left the URL to RocketBlocks in the chat. It's just rocketblocks.me. But yeah, thank you so much, Kenton, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their evening or afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good Thursday.
See you guys.